Okay, so we're going to talk about some ways in which AI tools can be used to help support finding literature on a given topic. And these, of course, are supplements to the usual techniques with the usual research guides and so forth. You can grab a copy of these slides either by holding up your camera to the screen and just clicking on the link, or by typing in that URL, which I also had just dropped into chat right before we got started here. And then it will ask you if you want to make a copy. It'll make a copy, and then you have your own copy that you can edit, do other things with, take notes with, add other things to it if it's useful, or just get rid of them if you don't find it useful. Okay, so one of the issues that people noted at first was that AI platforms, the general AI platforms, the large language models, can often hallucinate references. And there's all sorts of cases where lawyers submitted briefs with cases that didn't exist, where people submitted papers with references that didn't exist. And certainly this has happened for our students too. It's a bit less common now, especially if you use some of the deep research or the thinking models. It's more likely that you'll find real resources out there, real articles and so forth. And you can also, add a prompt to provide links to the resources and so forth, which makes it more likely that they actually will exist, or at least you find out pretty quickly that it doesn't. But we're going to talk more about some specialized tools that focus on providing relevant resources for you for a given topic. And basically, a few things that you can do with AI is that with the general platforms is that they're pretty good at coming up with a summary of existing literature on a topic, as well as providing citations and links. And you can ask it to put it in whatever format's appropriate in your discipline. And again, that reduces the likelihood of hallucinations, especially if you use the thinking models, as they're often called, rather than the fast models. And another thing that they're often used for is just to also give you to ask it, once you come up with a topic or a question, to ask it to generate some keywords that you can use in literature searches, although most of us are probably pretty good at that from years of doing that. But it's one way you can use these. So some of the ways in which AI can be helpful in beginning a research project is finding what has already been done. Now, this is, if you're already pretty familiar with an area, you can just look at the bibliography and look at citations and so forth. But if you want to move into an area that you haven't done as much with, you can find relevant prior literature, databases, or other platforms where you might be able to find resources. You can ask it, where can I find some good information about these sources, about this study, or peer-reviewed sources? It's also pretty good at summarizing research findings in general. We'll go through a few examples of that. And another way in which it could be used, and I think I've heard from a number of people who've been using it this way more recently, is not only for going out and finding literature, but finding literature that meets specific criteria if you want to do a meta-analysis. So that if you only want to use studies that have at least a given number of observations, or studies that take certain factors into account, AI tools are a pretty good way of going out and sorting through everything and just finding what those studies are. Now, if you've already found the studies, you could upload it, but that could be part of your search criteria to look for studies that have these characteristics. And from there, you can, read them yourselves, or at least sort through to make sure that the results are accurate. But, there are so many resources out there that this could be a really efficient way of at least getting started in general. So these are the tools we're going to be talking about: Semantic Scholar, Elicit, Research Rabbit, Connected Papers, Litmaps, Consensus, and NotebookLM. And I just want to talk briefly about each of these, some of the features, and I'd like you to explore them a bit and play with it. And you're welcome to do that as we go along, because you do have the links there. Semantic Scholar was developed by Paul Allen, one of the co-founders of Microsoft. It's a nonprofit, so it's a free AI-powered search engine that that contains data from a very large number of scientific studies. Once you find some articles, the citations can be exported into BibTeX for LaTeX users, could be exported into EndNote or in MLA, APA, or Chicago styles. They also have an ASTA tool, which is relatively recent. It's in beta testing, I believe now. Maybe it's a little bit beyond beta. But basically what it will do is it will not only find the resources, but it will go through and generate a literature summary. It will do comparisons of different studies, or et cetera. It will generate reports on a given topic. And it will also, if you provide it with some data or use some of the data sets that are already available, will do some basic data analysis to investigate issues and generate reports on that. And I think for each of these resources, I did put in a link to some videos that might help you use it if you get stuck on anything or to find out more about what it can do. So, Elicit is another one, is another really useful tool that many people are using. There's both a free and a paid version. And what it will do, though, is if you submit a research question, it will go out and find studies. I should have made a note of this. I think it will find maybe the top 20 or so papers, or it will locate 20 resources. And then you provide it with the research question. It will evaluate the relevance and reliability of the studies using some built-in criteria in terms of the sample size, in terms of various other characteristics, what types of things are controlled for in the study, and so on. And then it will generate a report. But the report actually is something you can then interact with using its own AI interface. And I could put a link here. Let's just jump over there for a minute. And apparently that link doesn't work. I will fix that link. But if you go into Elicit, there is a link. I'm sorry. Yeah, if you go into Elicit, not Elicit, where was it? Yes, if you go Semantic Scholar. I got ahead of myself, sorry. If you go into the Semantic Scholar website, there is a link in there to ASTA tools, and I'm not sure how I got the wrong link there. And here again are some examples and tutorials for that. Elicit, oh, this is where I'm sorry, I didn't get much sleep the last few days. Here's a sample report, which is apparently broken, but if you go through Elicit and you work through it, you can take a look at the sample report and then query it. And any work that you found or any resources you found can be saved and exported and connected to your Zotero account if you have one, which is a nice tool for collecting resources online. And again, here's some YouTube videos related to it. Research Rabbit is another interesting online citation mapping tool. It's fairly popular. And basically, you enter your research interests and it will find related articles and authors. You can put in a title, keywords, the DOI number for a study, and add relevant materials to a collection. So you can build a collection of resources, and then you can find similar articles based on previous searches. And I think it gives you the option of seeing a map of these things. So you can look at the prior studies in a given topic, and you can look at follow-up studies as well. And it gives you a nice little visual map. We can look at any of these that you'd like, but let's first go through an overview of these. Connected papers is very similar. It will generate 5 graphs showing you a map of how the studies connect to each other in terms of who cited who. 5 graphs a month for the free version. If you find it useful, it's $6 a month. And basically, many of these are drawing from the Semantic Scholar database. And any resources you find can be exported to BibTeX, Zotero, RIS, which is another format for bibliographical citations, or into a CSV file. And I linked to a user guide video. And Litmaps is very, very similar. And this will allow you to, I believe, in each search, connect to up to 20 articles or 20 studies. And it provides a graph of connected papers in the field again, relying on a database of over 270 million papers that keeps growing. And again, it gives you a visual map showing how different studies and authors are connected to each other. Consensus is a little bit different. You enter a research question, it will find studies related to that. The free version will find 10 studies and so forth. But it will also provide some pro-search analysis of up to 20 papers, and then 3 deep searches, not surges, sorry about that. But what's interesting about this is when you enter the research question, it will find some of the most relevant literature out there, and then it will give you a consensus meter answering the question with yes or no. I think it was yes or no, or maybe true or false, but basically indicating if there is a consensus in the literature on a given topic. And the last one we're going to talk about, and we can take a look at this, is NotebookLM. And we do have free access, well, anyone has free access to NotebookLM, but it is part of our Google package here on campus. And you can already add in, you can use, well, ever since it was created, you could upload information to it in the form of papers, websites, public YouTube videos, audio files, and websites. But when you click on the Add Sources tab, when you create your notebook, there is the option of searching for web or Google Drive. And what I didn't mention here, actually, let's take a quick look at that for just a second. And I see there's some chat things. Okay, so there is a chat. Okay, thank you, Ebru, for sharing the link. I do have here NotebookLM, and I just created one right before this. I've been using my own account for this, so I hadn't really used the campus version of it. But what I did basically is I typed in a question, and I chose, well, add sources is where you add things you've already found. But one of the options here is you can search for new resources. You can either search the web or you can search through your Google Drive, since this is a Google product, and you can choose either a fast result to get some really quick results or deep research. And if you're doing any serious research, I would suggest doing the deep research. The question I gave it was, what has happened to income inequality in the US over the last century, and why? And so it found every one of these resources here, and it gives you a list of those, and I just chose to select all the sources. Now, these sources may not be as reliable as those from the other platforms we talked about before, because those are generally peer-reviewed research. This will give you some other sources. Some of these things will be PDFs that are peer-reviewed research, but it will also include blog posts and anything else it finds on the web. Or if you already have a big collection in your Google Drive of files, it will search through there to find anything relevant. And then it will do all the things that it does with any other notebook. But what's really interesting with this is a relatively new feature. I think it came out about 7 or 8 months ago. Before you would upload information, it would generate summaries of it, either as a podcast or as a video, mind map, generate reports or flashcards or quizzes, infographics, or now slide decks, which it does reasonably good with. The ability to go out and find other information to supplement the papers that you've already found can be really helpful. So those are the things I wanted us to talk about a bit. So what do you all think? Are there any things that you'd like to look at specifically, or shall we take a few minutes where you just try these things and report back? I did want this to be primarily hands-on sessions where you tried these things.
I'll just ask a quick question if I can, John. I tried Elicit and I did not see a free version. I went to Elicit and it immediately asked me to purchase something. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there. It's just I did not see a free version of that.
This was with Elicit?
Elicit, yeah.
Okay, I am in the Elicit now, and this is a free version. You do have to sign up for an account. Many of the, and if you click upgrade, it does, see, if you create an account, it defaults to a free one. If you want to pay for it, they will give you $12 a month and generate many more reports and more detail. But if
I'll
you
try
sign up,
that.
you
Thank
can
you.
use your Google account, your Gmail account to sign up for it. And I did that for all the cases where I could, just because it's easier than remembering another 8 or 9, login set of criteria. So here's some free examples, but we could actually put in any. Is there a specific topic you'd like to try, Steve?
Sure, you can ask it for, I'm curious about whether there's been any literature on employers' reactions to online education.
Okay. Let's say students.
No, to graduate students, online education. How about
Okay.
graduate students, online
Graduates
degrees, students' online degrees?
possess online graduate degrees.
Perfect.
Okay, so you give it a research question and it's evaluating the question strength. And it says this is a good one, but if you want, you could add more detail, more specifics. And in fact, it will suggest some. Okay, take the more specific one. And then the sources you can choose here. Research papers would be most appropriate there. I don't think we do a lot of experiments with clinics with that. And we will now, the free version will find the top 50 sources and extract from up to 10 of them.
Right.
And if you pay for it, it will do a lot more.
Right.
But it's a good starting point. And if you sign up for 3 or 4 of these, you can use each of them in sequence. Just like many students, before they had access to Gemini, the campus account would only be able to get 3 to 5 searches in other platforms. So they just sign up for accounts on 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 different platforms, and it allows them to use free accounts by just jumping from one to the other. So it's found 50 sources already. It's screening them based on whatever criteria it's using. And I think it's going to tell us what the criteria are here below. Okay, so it's checking whether, in fact, it does do a degree comparison. And the counts there are the number of papers that meet this. So the first question is, does the study compare online versus traditional or examine differential perceptions based on the degree? 33 of the 50 studies that it found did. 13, it wasn't clear from its scan of it, and 4 did not. Okay. Oops. So I didn't mean to, I don't know why it skipped. I was just trying to scroll down. Well, now it's extracting the data. So although it says it's populating the criteria. So it has found the top 10 sources based on the criteria. And now it is finding key metrics. And okay, it's extracted 60 pieces of data from the studies that it found. And now it's generating a report. And you can now interact with this report once it's finished, and ask it questions. And this is a whole lot faster than finding 50 citations and then reading 10 of them a bit more carefully to evaluate them. But again, it's a starting point, and it's a good way to find some really important studies. And each of these does take some time because they are doing a fair amount computations in the background, evaluating these things. So any questions on this while it's running? Oh, Michael, yes.
Yeah, I have a much more general question, John, and it's about, I don't know if there's a time for it or not, but it's about how I never see a demo of any AI that doesn't seem to me like it's like really impressive in terms of what the technology does. You know what I mean? This seems clearly powerful. I'm wondering, the weak link always seems to me like the data set, you know, and so I'm wondering, like you were saying, that there was no way to be sure that what the hits that we were going to get would be like refereed in any way. Is there any way to do that? Like, do any of these tools allow us to sort of work just with refereed sources? Not that really, to be honest, I've started to get worried about the quality of refereed sources. I think there are like the sort of emerging like journal mills that, you know, publish large numbers of papers that are at least nominally refereed, but not sort of meaningfully. So I guess I'm wondering, big question. You know, I'm wondering what ways there might be to sort of work with data to get improved results, more solid results.
In some of these, you're able to pick the source materials of the type, and some of them, for example, will give you PubMed as an option. Some of them will restrict it to Semantic Scholar. You know, I mean, ultimately, we have to rely on our own expertise to some extent, but it can help us do some initial screening so that we don't waste time reading hundreds of articles out there. I think if you're using one of the generative AI platforms, you could put in a restriction that it only provide reports from, or it only searches for peer-reviewed journal articles, for example. Or if you have a list of journals, for example, that are the top 50 or 100 journals in your field, you could upload that and ask it to only search for articles in those areas. One of the problems in many disciplines, though, is it often takes 1 to 3 years or 1 to 4 years from the time an article is submitted to the time it actually makes it to press. In economics, it's normally about 2 years from the time it's submitted to the time it actually goes to print. And you know, so there is a bit of delay. By using working papers and other things, you know, you get a bit more. But here it's giving you a report that you could then, you know, interact with. So let's just see what it's saying here. It's saying they generally prefer traditional degrees over this, with a stronger bias in interpersonal intensive fields like social work and teaching than in technical accounting roles, which would, I think, suggest the MBA might be a little bit better off there, you know, relatively, at least in general. It's partly affected by institutional accreditation and, you know, whether a hybrid delivery formats are used. But again, this is only 10 sources from a pool of 50. So, you know, it's a small number of studies, and you notice some of these it did not find full text, or it wasn't clear if it did. So, you know, use these at your own risk, but at least you can get the citations of the ones that look most promising, and then well, and here's some breakdown by degree, actually. Or by degree type. Now, this would also be a good sort of question, perhaps, to bring over to consensus, because that might not be a bad that's not consensus. Consensus is where I know I opened it. It's Elicit. Oh, maybe I didn't, or maybe, here we go, consensus. So just as another thing, let's say is an online graduate degree. You pose this as a question as highly valued as and I'll correct the spelling in a minute, a traditional graduate. I'll correct all the spelling. Oh, online graduate degree as high, geez. You know, I don't do this when I'm at my own computer as a traditional graduate degree. Okay, that's, I think, the same sort of question. And let's just see what it says. Oh, this one, I think this is a pro version because I reconnected to this and it's a, well, no, I was going to say it's a 7-day pro trial. But I didn't try the pro free this time. So here it's giving a very brief summary of what the literature is finding. Yeah, okay. And here, yeah, and there is that sort of meter. So yeah, so the consensus here is that, again, no, it's not, but it's not universal. That, yeah, so yeah, it's not a very large sample though, is it? Where So apparently did not find a lot of studies that evaluated the question. And again, that's going to vary quite a bit by online programs. You know, if it's one of the ones where you just pay a few $100s and you get your degree a few months later, it may not be valued as highly as one offered by an established institution. So, but again, it can find some sources that you can use. And once you have some sources, you can all that are reliable or relevant, you could then look at other sources, including Google Scholar, to see who has cited those. And Google Scholar now has some AI capabilities in beta format that you can turn on to find more information as well, which was something I meant to look at before the session, but I haven't. But once you get these, again, you can go through and search for studies that cite them, and you can also go back and look at their bibliographies to find what was done earlier. So there's not really, I'm not really sure there's a good way of addressing that question of finding reliable journal articles. You know, in general, I think to some extent, it's going to rely on you recognizing what are useful journals or relevant journals or highly rated journals in your fields, and evaluating the individual studies themselves. So has anyone tried any of these and found anything interesting or surprising or troubling?
So John, I have tried two of them. One is Connected Papers. And what I like about it, it gives you a bubble, and based on the size of that bubble, you know how impactful that study has been or how many times it has been cited. Number two, it gives connections to the other studies and with various kinds of dotted or straight or strong lines. And it tells you how the study is connected to other studies, you know, whatever study you are focusing on. So that's what I like. It gives you that visual graph or figure, we can say. So that's something interesting. My question to you is about Google LLM. I have used it almost like 6 months ago, 7 months ago for creating a podcast. I don't know if you or anyone in this room have any experience of creating videos with it, because podcasts used to be like 15 minutes long. Is it still the same? And videos, are they of good quality? And is it also there is a time limit for that? So that's my
I've only
question.
created a few, and the videos tended to be a bit shorter, but again, I only tried it 2 or 3 times, so I'm not really that sure. So, but I did want to get back to
I'll just step in. I've done podcast. I did a podcast for every week of my online course in the fall because I had a ton of materials that I created. So I was comfortable enough with that without having to create materials to upload all of the different lecture notes and things I've done over the years and have it create the podcast. Um, you can specify it in LM how long you want the podcast to be. So longer ones are about 40 minutes.
Nice. That's new for me.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think there's actually there's a setting somewhere, I don't remember where it gets up. So you can choose, length. Even the longer ones, they weren't as in depth. I will, for people here, I'll say students, I got really positive feedback early on from students who love
Yeah.
to listen to even the short one, like
Yeah.
on a ride, to school or whatever, on the ride to work, because it gave them the overlay. And then they felt when then they finally did go to the book or lecture notes or something, they actually felt better about it because they got that lay of the land about how it's set up. So they were actually pretty popular. They're really not a substitute for student reading, and I don't know that students used them that way successfully, but
Yeah.
I think they were a real compliment that helped them make better time when they finally got to the reading that I assigned. So
Yeah. No, and you do not have a paid account for
I don't. I actually used the LM account. I had started using one with my own Gmail, which is limited.
right.
But I use the account now that we have with our email, with
Yeah.
our Oswego account, is what
Yeah.
so the most of them are done through there.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, John.
And I wanted to show an illustration of that first point. Here's just one article, and it shows you what other studies cited it and, who quoted it and so forth. That one just doesn't have that many, but I had put some of mine in just because I knew where they were a while back. But it shows you connections. So if you find an interesting paper, you can find who cited it, who is doing similar research, and it can fill in some gaps. So, it's a good thing to do when you're getting close to finishing your review of the literature, is to go out and find out if there's anyone else who you just missed in your review of the literature that's doing related research, and then to see who else is doing things connected to that. It's a great thing for PhD students in terms of delaying completing a dissertation, because you can always find more articles related to anything. Yeah, but I've used NotebookLM in the same way in creating summaries for each chapter of my econometrics course and sharing those with students as a way of helping them get through it. One other thing I've encouraged, this is beyond the research aspect of it, but one of the things I've encouraged students to do is that in the capstone course, they do presentations every week, and some of the papers are a little bit more technical than they're comfortable with. So I've encouraged them to put the relevant papers into NotebookLM, generate that podcast or the summary, and also to do a little bit of a self-test with it to make sure they understand it. But we have another session that Amanda's going to be presenting, I think either later this week or next week, on NotebookLM. But it's a really powerful tool, and students are using it, if they're aware of it, and many of them are now, fairly heavily to summarize materials and to test their own understanding about it. Other questions or other reactions on your testing of these tools? Anyone get results that they found useful? Did you find any resources that you hadn't seen on a topic, or any other concerns about using these things? These tools are only going to keep getting better. And I just picked some of the most commonly used ones. There's hundreds of them out there now. just this past week, I saw a new one pop up, but it's aimed mostly towards students, where you give it a research question and it will generate first the relevant literature, but then it will actually generate a whole paper based on that literature with appropriate footnotes, endnotes, citations, or footnotes or endnotes and citations in whatever format the instructor wants. So there are some concerns about some of these things too, obviously.
John, are there tools, out of curiosity, are there tools, and obviously this would be good for us, but not for us as professors, where you can give, is there a tool where you can give it the tool certain papers, certain articles, whatever, and ask it to generate a summary of those papers, or like a report based on those papers, where in other words, where you give it, where the prompter, where I or a student would give the tool the papers and ask it to summarize them.
Yes. And in fact, students are doing that and have been doing that for
Sure.
about 2.5 years now. It's a really common use of AI tools, uploading a paper or a chapter of a reading or pointing it to an online reading and so forth, and asking it to generate summaries and perhaps responding to specific questions about that. So,
But can you include several?
yes, NotebookLM is particularly good for that, but pretty much any of these, well, many of these tools will do the same thing, where if you upload or you give it several different references and ask for a summary of those, they will generate that for you. So will NotebookLM. I'm not sure what the limitations are on the college accounts. I know in personal accounts, recently at least, they were limited to, I think it was 20 inputs. It may have bumped up more than that, but basically, you could upload papers, you could upload Word documents. I believe you could upload, well, you could upload PDFs and websites and so forth. And even, again, YouTube videos it will summarize, or audio files. And it will generate a summary of the whole collection of those. And those summaries generally can be then queried using in a chat interface if it's not answering the questions that you had. And so, it's a powerful set of tools. And sometimes it makes mistakes again, but more often than not, if you use the slower processing models, which take a little bit longer, but they're getting much, much better. One researcher, I forgot who it was, noted that he had uploaded all of his published studies into NotebookLM and asked it to generate a slideshow summarizing his research, and he noted that it was remarkably accurate, and it did a much better job of summarizing his research career than he would have been able to do if he was just sitting there at the computer doing it, because it found connections and things that might not have been as obvious when you're sitting there looking at each one individually. Oh, okay. Yes. Michael.
Yeah, John, I was asking earlier about ways to sort of like limit the database, and you indicated that you could specify a set of journals. Are there any particular tools here that are especially conducive to that? That would allow you to work with a particular set of journals, or to ask your students to?
Well, if you want to limit it to specific journals, one thing you could always do is to ask for a rating of journals in a particular field, and any of the interfaces should be able to do that pretty well. If we go to, oops, that's not it. If we go to, where am I logged in here? Let's go to Gemini, for example, which is in here somewhere. There we go. So if we go to Gemini, let's say provide a list of the top 100 economic journals, and save this as a Google sheet. It will probably do that pretty well. And it will probably just primarily just search out there for studies of these. Well, we don't need to search my Gmail docs or drives for this, but oh, I guess apparently I needed to do that. Never mind. I mostly use other tools than Gemini, although Gemini has gotten, let me try that again. I'm just going to copy that back again. And it should give me the same restriction, maybe. Okay, so yes, we will continue on that. And when I use Gemini, it's with one of my other accounts typically. Okay, so it's stored it as a Google Keep document. So if we click on this, it will give us a whole list of them. And you could always download this as a spreadsheet, I believe. Again, I haven't done as much with the Google AI tools, but with most AI tools, you could download as a spreadsheet, upload that into your prompt and say, find articles in this collection of journals, or, or just restrict it by saying, please only provide references or studies in peer-reviewed journals in this discipline. But again, as Mike mentioned, not all peer review is alike. There are some of those pay-to-play type journals where, if you pay a certain amount, they will find peer reviewers who will, again, respond and in return for getting some payment, will approve pretty much anything. And, occasionally we've had people do that when they were coming up for tenure, where you pay $1,000 or so and you're pretty much guaranteed a publication. Okay. But this could be a starting point, by finding journals that you find appropriate and just putting that as part of your prompt.
And so any of these tools should have reference to have access to those journal articles, like in major journals.
Well, they won't all have access to the full articles, but they will at least have access to the
abstracts.
And that's the starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Now, however, in economics, probably 60 to 80% of the articles that get published are also posted on the web as preprints or something similar. So it may very well, I haven't tried that, but it may very well be able to find printed versions or PDF versions of that.
Thank you.
And again, if we go to scholar.google, this was something I hadn't included, but I should have. Mostly because I just forgot to. There is now Scholar Labs, which you can turn on. And again, it operates in the same way as many of those. So actually, let's try that prompt that Steve had suggested. Our graduates from, or do employers have preferences for students that graduate from traditional graduate programs versus fully online graduate programs? And we'll see how it does with that. Oh, yes, the graphic references. Let's try that again. Well, it figured out what I wanted, actually. And it found at least a number of studies so far. Well, it's evaluated 43. It knew what I meant, probably recognizing the P and the P and the opening bracket are right next to each other. And it just gives you a little bit of a summary of the articles and links to the PDFs when they're available. And again, that's one of the nice things about Google Scholar, that it will search abstracts, but it will also link to PDF versions of those when those are available. And again, you can also see what it cites and who it cited and follow those as a trail yourself. But much of that is what these tools are doing, basically, by just looking at who is citing who and so forth. Other questions or other experiences? Sure.
How does this work? Some of these tools work with like online textbooks. Are there integrations where students can like query their textbooks, or does it come from the publisher?
The things that are, that depends. It depends on the publisher. And, you know, if the publisher provides, well, clearly in the open source community, that's not so hard because, you know, there are so many open texts out there. And for example, I created chatbots for my courses using open resources because, you know, there's some good texts for many introductory courses out there. The closest I've seen would be, no, I don't think this would do. I was going to say a number of publishers release their books with through Perusal, which is basically something where students can interact with the text by doing social annotations. But I don't think Perusal has that sort of a search capability. No, in fact, that would kind of defeat the purpose because it's often used as a way of getting students to read things rather than summarizing it. The only thing that I can think of is that some publishers may very well have integrated that into their online access to the text. But now, having said that, you know, AI companies have not been incredibly ethical about respecting copyright. And I know some people have created chatbots where they don't upload the textbook themselves, but they ask it to provide help for students and note in the text where they can find solutions or in what parts of the test will, the textbook will allow them to help solve problems, and it will respond with page numbers and will, you know, or section numbers and so forth, even though technically the AI platform should not have been trained on that data. But there's so much stuff that's uploaded to the web illegally, and you know, the training databases for these large language models were not particularly ethical in terms of what they chose to include and exclude in the reviews and building their training database. So you'd be amazed, you know, if you do a search for anything in a given textbook, you are likely to find some information that has made it into the training database, which is one of the reasons why there's so many lawsuits right now from publishers and from, you know, and from news providers and so forth, claiming, you know, or challenging the fact that their information was used without permission. So any other questions or anything else that you found interesting or not interesting, or does any of this seem like it might be helpful?
At least to me, 100%, John, definitely.
Okay, well, play with it. You know, it gives you answers really quickly, which is something that didn't always happen. I mean, I remember working with card catalogs way back, and you know, and hard text, hardbacked indexes of economic articles and so forth way back, and you know, the tools we had before AI were pretty impressive, but this just allows us to do things a little more quickly and a little more efficiently. And it's good to catch things that you might have missed otherwise. You know, and
I mean, I would add it's a really helpful tool and it will save a lot of time and help catch things you miss. But, these LLM models, their algorithms and what they use reflect the biases of training and the writing that has trained them. And I wonder if those biases mean that certain things will get overlooked. As people try to automate their literature review, because as you and I both remember, John, I'm sure Steve does too, um, that process of finding and locating things and decided where they fit into your study and whether or not they deserve to be included and all of those things. Just like in any other AI automated task, potentially a group of people is losing that skill to be or not developing that skill. But I also just kind of worry that whether or not, as these LLMs go forward, and this is about their creators and their owners, about whether, just like Google searches, certain content gets boosted and others do not, and what the impacts are that. I think that question is far bigger than this kind of how-to session, but
I
it's something to think about.
most of the boosting just comes from the number of citations, but that's going to happen however we do this. Before we had these tools, we'd look at what we knew were some of the major articles, and then we just see who cited them and see what they cited. So the same sort of bias was there. The difference is this is looking in many more places than we were likely to do before. So there's always a bias, and the bias is going to show up in how things are ranked, because those things that everyone is citing is going to get ranked much more highly than some of the other things. But I may be wrong, but I think this is going to find a lot of the things that we might have missed if we were using other ways of getting to this. There's always going to be a bias in anything that's trained on human behavior and human responses and human publications. And, I'm not sure if there's a good way around that other than perhaps by including in your search criteria that might perhaps open up a broader range of items.
Right, but I would say, I think iteration, the cynic, the skeptic, ever the skeptic. I'm just going to say the next iteration of AI, that LLM responses will be boosted by people who pay to have them boosted. And that's how these companies are going to make their ROIs. So that's not happening now. So I think citations play a big role, but I think it will happen, just like it's happened with Google.
Liz, that's kind of what animated my question earlier in some ways. I'm wondering about the ways that there might be to limit data, if not just like raw hits, then maybe qualified hits, like disciplinary hits or something. You know what I mean? There might, if not based on a sort of discipline policing set of sources or discipline policed set of sources, then in some way, again, based not on open hits online, but hits by a qualified set of readers or something. I have the same worry.
It's possible, and certainly we've seen that with Google search or with any form of search. There are some things that get boosted based on, ads and things that they're paying for. I'm not sure we're going to see that as much with academic studies. I'm not sure many people out there coming up with working papers are going to pay to boost things. Maybe people will. We don't know. And the evolution of these things is unpredictable in a lot of ways.
Maybe publishers.
And publishers might very well, especially the more expensive the Elsevier and others who charge a lot for their journals, might perhaps push this stuff out. On the other hand, OER articles get a lot more citations on average, holding other things constant. And maybe this could lead to more things being published in an open environment. We don't know. But yeah, certainly, we might see some of that, but so many things that were thought unimaginable have become commonplace in the last few years. So yeah, the independence of the Fed, for example. Okay, but we should probably wrap this up. If anyone has any questions, let me know and I'll try to answer them and play with them and see how they work and be on the lookout for bias or other problems.
Very helpful, John. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And I'll try to be more organized in my next session. There we go.